Hello, I'm Willie and welcome to Horsepower. Today I'm going to show you how to put a GT86 electric power steering column into my Toyota Celica GT4 rally car. If you're keen on doing this yourself, a lot of this info will be generic and work with any car. Let's get into it. This is the latest upgrade for my Celica. While the motor and gearbox is all out getting rebuilt, I thought this is a good opportunity to give this a go. I've wanted to do this for quite a few years now. I quite like the idea of it. So for those that don't know, this is an electric power steering column. So what this will allow me to do is delete the entire hydraulic power steering system out of the Celica, and then this gets installed into where the original steering column is, and greatly simplifies the mechanical system. So this is out of a GT86. These basically come in pretty much every new car these days, and there's a number of them you can use. The Prius ones are quite commonly used. The reason I chose this, it's a sports car, so it should give some sporty steering. I've got an 8.6 and I love the way it feels and how it steers, so I think this is a good choice, and they are reasonably priced and available. They're quite a cool piece of technology really. So this is the motor here, and there's a some kind of gear arrangement there. I haven't pulled it apart, but I might do at some point. And then there is a sensor there which senses the torque on the input. So it adjusts the assistance depending on how hard you turn the wheel, and all of the clever stuff is in here, which is its control unit. So that's an important part which ties in with the system, so if anyone else wants to upgrade to this, make sure you get this as well. So it's fairly sort of simple in terms of what I need to do. There's a main power wire which goes there, so that goes from the controller to the motor. There's power in and ground, and then there's can high, can low, and so that is the tricky part. So these do require a can input to run. There are some other systems which don't. The Prius system, for example, will default to its highest assistance level when it has no can input, so that's one reason why people often go for that. There is a company in Australia called AGT Engineering, and they do lots of cool stuff with Subaru wiring looms and such. This is what AGT have sold me. So this is a CAN emulator, so it outputs a CAN signal into the controller, and then what you can do, you've got a couple of options. You can either attach it to a speed input, so it varies its assistance depending on your speed. Typically you'd want low assistance at high speed and high assistance at low speed to enable the car to turn in easily. So we can see the inputs and outputs it's got there. Probably what I'm going to do is run it off a dial, which means I can manually adjust it, which means it's always the same. However, you can then adjust it, so I may want more or less assistance. It's quite heavy steering in the Celica, especially with the aggressive front LSD, so it might be a case of leave it on the highest assistance all the time, but I can play around with that later on. Seeing as I can delete the entire hydraulic power steering system out of the Celica, I can tidy up the engine bay quite a lot. So what I'm going to do, as you've already seen maybe, is obviously the power steering pump is gone, so I'm going to move the alternator from the front of the motor back round to where the power steering pump sits. This is really good for a couple of reasons. One, it takes the alternator away from the hotness of the turbo and all of that, and two, it moves the weight further down and further back towards the centre of the car, which is also a very nice thing. And then what I'm going to do is delete my power steering cooler and then replace that with a gearbox cooler. Right now I've got the factory ST185 steering column out. We can lay the two next to each other. There's a few challenges that pop up. Firstly, the mounting points are obviously different. So we head back here, we have 4 holes, and then here we have 2 holes and then a pivot. One nice thing about this column is that it's got an adjustable thing on it, so it slides in and out and up and down, which is quite nice. The Celica has some real fancy electronic thing which doesn't work anymore. I don't think it's ever worked. But the main challenges are obviously mounting it up. So ideally I want to make it reversible. You never know, it might not like it. It might turn out to be shit. So I want to be able to then revert back to the old system, so I don't want to chop everything up too much. So ideally make some mounting system which can bolt on, bolt off. We also need to be aware that there's a lot of torque going through this, so it actually needs to be quite rigid, quite strong. I don't want it obviously turning out of its mount, and then that's going to be a bad time. Other challenges are, so this is a big bulky thing which obviously doesn't exist on this, so I may need to do some clearancing. We'll see once we get into the car. Obviously we've got to mount up the control unit somewhere as well, but due to the length of the wires it should be pretty flexible on where it can go. Another thing is, so this is the ignition barrel and this doesn't have one, so I've got a couple of options. One, I can sort of take this off and try and graft it on here, which probably will work, might be a bit nasty, but the other option is to do away with an ignition barrel altogether and just run a couple of switches on the dash, which may be a nicer, easier way of doing it. I'll cross that bridge when we get there. And the final challenge, well, one of the final challenges is the indicator stalk. So the ST185 one slides on there nicely, won't slide on there, so that's too big. So got to come up with a solution there. The ideal solution would be to go away from the old school indicator stalks and run a PDM with a touch button can pad. It's a bit outside the scope of what I want to do at the moment, however I'd love to do that one day. And of course the other challenge is to make a shaft work. I don't foresee that being a big issue. Fortunately all these splines are the same from the GT86 from the Celica. I don't actually know who makes this, whether it's Toyota or Subaru, but they kept the splines the same from the 30-year-old Toyota, so that's pretty cool. It probably will be a case of using the factory GT86 shaft and simply shortening it down. here's the dash bar out. See, I've made clearance here for the motor. Butchered it up and turned my workshop into an absolute mess of grinding dust, but such is how these things go. So I'm going to mount up this back mount first, which will sit on the pivot. I'll plasma cut up a plate here, which will then bolt through into the plate. I'll have to remove that and probably get that plate welded onto here. I wanted to keep these for backwards compatibility, but I don't really think that's going to work, unfortunately. Now this is all ground back, made up this little bracket, pretty basic wee thing, but that holds onto the pivot mount of the steering column. And then over here, got this little plate here which I plasmaed up, and then countersunk some holes in it, dropped in some countersunk bolts and then welded them up. So that will drop down, and then when you mount up the column, you just line it up into the holes and then spin some nuts onto it. So that will go on something like that, and then the steering column will drop onto it. Now we've got it all fitted in place and we're happy with how everything sits and everything clears. We've obviously taken a lot of strength out of here, big hole out of there, plus all of that. What we need to do now is re-strengthen it, so add in some more material, scallop that fill that in with a plate, and basically bring it back to where it should be strength wise. Fortunately it ties into the firewall just here, but this is actually pretty critical in terms of strength. Obviously you're holding the steering wheel, and if you have a big crash and you want something steady to hold on to, obviously. So yeah, it's very important that we make this nice and strong. We don't want it to fatigue, we don't want it to ever crack and break. So yeah, it's pretty important. Here's the reinforcing all done. There's another wee plate in here, wee plate here, and obviously that's filled in. And then underneath there's this little brace here too. It's not going to be quite as strong as when it was originally, but it should be pretty close. Here's our control valve housing. Here's our pinion. And this bearing here sits at the top of the housing, just in there, and supports the top of the shaft. One thing to consider is that we've no longer got power steering fluid being pumped through this housing, so this bearing's going to go unlubricated. What I wanted to do was to replace this with a seal ball bearing, and then it doesn't need the fluid going through to lubricate it. Unfortunately, I could not find one, but what I could find was a seal. And then this seal will fit nicely down into that groove there, so that's 42mm, so that'll get pressed in, and then I'll pack that up with grease, and that should keep that bearing nice and lubricated for the rest of its life. That's the two seals and the bearing all pressed in. You can see the bearing there in the middle, grease packed in either side. Hopefully that lives a long and healthy life. So I've packed up the bottom bearing as well. Basically gravity will basically stop all the oil from falling away, and it's got a seal just below it. So I'm pretty confident that's going to keep lubricated for some time. That is one completed manualised power steering rack. So this loop here simply loops between the two cylinders. The other way to do it would have been to take the whole thing apart and remove, or put a hole in the internal piston in there. This just seemed a lot easier. I've blocked off all these lines here. They're basically just normal fittings that have been welded up. That's just to stop dirt and dust and whatever else getting in there. I was going to replace these outer racks, but they're actually in pretty good condition. This outer one, I'll get a new one. That one there also seems pretty good. So what I've got to do now is put it into the car. Now that we've got the column in place, it's time to make it all work with the rest of the car. So this is the factory ST185 indicator stalk, and I've got an original one and a modified one here. So that one's got this sort of center bore thing, and this one I've taken it out. That's so we can butt it right up against that. I've also taken this back, so essentially what this does is it gets it far back enough on the column so the steering wheel has room on the front of the column there. And in order to mount it, I made one of these. So what this does is I've copied the original backing plate off the old column and plasma cut a new one. So I drew this up in CAD and then plasmaed it out. It slips over there, and I'll just weld that on. While I was at it, I thought I may as well make a mount for my power tune dash. So that's what this top bit is here. So it mounts onto those four lugs there. Pretty cool piece of kit, these. If you don't know what they are, I recommend you check them out. So this is the old mount, and sort of made that a while ago in a bit of a rush. There's nothing really wrong with it, but I think this was a nicer solution. So yeah, once it was drawn up, it was pretty easy. So all I've got to do now is give that a paint, a tidy up, and a fizz on there. And then the other problem was the ignition. I could have easily gone and put some switches and buttons in, but I actually quite like the key, and so I chopped this off the old column, and I'm going to mount that about there with this piece here. So again, this is a plasma cut piece, so that will go on the bottom of the column there, and then mount on there like that. Pretty simple, and then I don't have to change any wiring, and hopefully that'll work as intended. The steering column is all done, all bolted up, shouldn't be coming out again anytime soon. Yeah, pretty happy with how it all worked out. I had to make some little modifications to this bracket here, just to clear the adjustment. So this is a telescopic column, so it slides back and forth, so I didn't take that into account when I first made that. Anyway, it was an easy fix. Back here we can see the wee steering shaft. This obviously slides in and out here, so I can take that out with the column in place, and the boot there, and the blanking plate, which all worked out really nicely. Super happy with that. So the next job is to mount up the electronics for it. So another wee job that I've just done is plasma cut this block off plate. So this is obviously the HVAC system here, and the only part of it that I'm using is the air coming out to top to demist the windscreen. So there's no venting out coming towards you, so I don't need any of this. There was a big plastic bit here which I've deleted, and instead in its place we'll get this plate here. So I drew this up and cut it on the plasma, 3mm aluminium, might be a bit overkill, so I'll silicone on that and screw it in. And then there's another plate to go down there somewhere, left it somewhere, and then that will serve another purpose of bolting up the steering control unit. It's actually quite a weighty unit, this, so I'll figure out some mounts to bolt that up there. As well as that, there's the CAN bus emulator for the steering column, which I'll need to mount around here as well somewhere, and do some wiring. Obviously these plug into the computer, and then these need to be wired to the battery, and these ones here to the CAN bus emulator. So I'll get out my wiring and make that all work. So yeah, not far away from putting the interior all back together and then having a running car. Here it is, finally installed. We can see the CAN bus emulator there flashing away, so the red means it's got power and the green means it's got CAN bus, so that feeds into the control unit. The car's obviously stationary at the moment. It's got beautiful light steering. That's one pretty cool thing about this system. So if your engine's not running for whatever reason, you can still push your car around the shed with power steering, which is really nice. So I've taken it for a drive. It feels really nice, feels really natural. You wouldn't know it was an electric system, you'd just think it was hydraulic, judging by the feel of it. So I'm really happy with it, it's worked out really nice. So yeah, if you want to do this to your car, I highly recommend it. That's it for this episode. Thanks for watching. See you next time.